this is an American story more than anything because it is my identity, and I was born and raised in the U.S. My whole life was in the U.S. Like, I think that's the biggest connection, is that a lot of Americans will relate to this and my exploration of trying to figure out these other cultures that I am from, but I didn't know much about,
You're listening to Calling Others. Calling Others is a podcast mini-series featuring the stories of young Swana American creatives and advocates. This podcast is a little reminder. Our personal stories matter. They have more power over politics than we realize. I'm your host, Nastar Anfar, and this episode's guest is Colette Ghunim. Colette is a documentary filmmaker of Palestinian and Mexican descent based in Chicago and a founding member of the Mezcla Media Collective, an organization rooted in supporting female-identifying and non-binary filmmakers. In this episode, we talk about Colette's two films, The People's Girls, documenting street harassment in Egypt, and Traces of Home, documenting her own journey back to her parents' homes in Mexico and in Palestine. In our conversation, we dive into being happy, healing intergenerational trauma, and understanding the relationship between the violence of the patriarchy and the violence of colonization, and more. Here's our conversation in today's episode.
I first studied communications in college, knowing that I wanted to do something in film and TV. My father was a wedding videographer growing up, and I was always around cameras and always loved the idea of editing and making fun videos, but I didn't know that this was going to become my career choice. So as I got to college, I was able to get more experience around the world of media and different avenues I could follow. And so I was interested in children's television. I loved working with children. So I was like, maybe educational programming. So I interned at Nickelodeon, which was an amazing experience, but I wanted to do something more socially impactful, I guess, more meaningful content. So I ended up working at a film festival in Egypt when I studied abroad. And while I was there, I was able to watch all these incredible documentary films and see the power of documentary in really sharing different perspectives on social issues. And that it was not only changing people's mindsets, but also policies nationally and internationally. So it was something I just was I really want to pursue it. So I went for it.
That is quite a journey from your dad being a wedding videographer to you doing children's shows and then working into documentary work. That's a very interesting path. So specifically about your work, I'd love to hear about what personal experiences led you to the films that you've been working on. I mean, we can start maybe with just an explanation of Traces of Home and The People's Girls in a few sentences, and then I'd love to hear about the background of both of those films and how you got to where you got.
So I studied abroad in Egypt, as I mentioned, and while I was there, I met a friend who was a documentary photographer, and her work was just so, inspiring. And I was like, it would be cool to be able to work together, maybe actually making this not only a photo project, but actually a movie. So she was working on a story about street harassment in Cairo and how women are talking about their experiences and figuring out why this is such a huge issue in Egypt, and also what kind of solutions there are to tackle such a, strong problem in society. So we ended up working on this film together for a year, which was my first short film. It was half an hour long. And it really just went into depth around these different women's stories that were willing to share their experiences. And then both men and women talking about ways that they've really tried to tackle the issue in their communities in Egypt. So then I came back to the U.S. after I finished The People's Girls in 2016.
In the world of remote work, sometimes technology fails us. With that in mind, enjoy this little interruption and this clip from Colette explaining Traces of Home.
I decided to make this film after really watching all of the discriminatory policies come to light in the previous administration around the refugee ban and family separations at the border. Knowing that my parents had very similar stories of forced migration, I wanted to actually go back and understand what happened to them, relating it to the political situation in the US at that time. And as the film went into production and I started going deeper into the story, I began to realize that the deeper reasons I was really going on these journeys with my parents was not necessarily to try to understand, my cultural background and why I was disconnected to these roots that were cut off from me, but that it was more to understand my parents themselves and why we had such difficult relationships growing up together, specifically with my mom, and really exploring the topic of intergenerational trauma in my family and how that affected our dynamics and my own feelings of identity and self-worth growing up in the suburbs of the US. So since then, it's definitely been a real big healing journey to go on these trips to both Mexico and Palestine, trying to find my parents' original homes for the first time with them, while also beginning to explore my childhood and my upbringing and how their trauma affected that as well.
I'd also love to hear more about why specifically you picked the issues that you picked in exploring the journey back to your family's homes.
So when I first made an interview with my parents, I asked them, do you see any similarities of your two migration stories, or what brought you here to the US? And my mom said something that was very pivotal for my understanding of how similar their stories were, even though they came from across the world. And my mom said, Colette, we didn't come here just to look for a better life, but we were actually both running away from something in our countries. And I was like, wow, that actually makes it very clear of why I'm making this film of I don't know why I was so disconnected from these roots, and understanding, that both of them were forced to leave their homes for different reasons, both on the political side of the occupation plus domestic violence for my mom, and how, colonization and patriarchy are in both of their stories, even on the domestic level, but then also on a national level too. So there are a lot of interesting parallels between the domestic violence and the violence of a nation.
You'd mentioned that transformation from the political to that, intergenerational trauma. How did that come about? Where did you see that play into the film? Did it just, as you were telling the story, did you just realize that that's what it was becoming, or was it something that you predicted in any way?
So no, I was not planning to put myself in the film at all. It was going to be about my parents and about their stories of coming to the U.S. That was it. It was very surface level of just going on these trips with them. And it was very much of a cultural thing for me, and not knowing why I never grew up being Mexican or Palestinian, not having that cultural relation. And so I started going to racial identity therapy at the beginning of the film to talk about how that disconnect from my racial identity affected me. But my relationship with my mom just kept coming up over and over and over again as the thing that was actually bothering me, of not having a strong relationship growing up and not knowing why I just didn't feel like I could be myself in my own house. And through grant applications and getting feedback from other mentors, they were like, Colette, you need to start going deeper into the real reasons you want to make this film. Of course, it's nice that you're going on these trips, but there must be something deeper inside of you of why you want to do this. And it became very clear that oh wow, this is actually really much more about my own healing journey, and I'm sort of using the shield of going to Mexico and Palestine to be able to get to know who my parents are, not these countries. It's my parents are the ones I want to know, and why I felt so disconnected from them and from myself.
I feel like a lot of children of immigrants or immigrants themselves have that urge to figure out their parents. There's a wall. So I feel like that's a very unique experience. You're doing it. I am living through you. I'm I would love to know the things that I don't know.
Right. And there's it's very hard to break down that barrier that they've put up for since your childhood.
It's a protection mechanism for themselves and also for you. That's so interesting. I can't wait to see that. I feel like that's such a personal story.
Looping back towards the People's Girls, I'd love to hear about what you found most surprising when you were telling that story and what you found to be the most expected. Because it is such a a deeply personal story, but also one where you don't have as much control over the characters because you are filming live and you're filming perpetrators of violence.
Yeah, I mean, definitely when we were trying to figure out like what is the root cause in this film of like why harassment is such a big issue, like we were thinking, oh, maybe it's like a society thing, like maybe it's a religion thing, like we couldn't place it. We thought it was very much a men problem too. We did street interviews, just like on the street, asking like, what do you think is the reason that this is such a big issue? And it was unfortunately like both men and women doing the victim blaming and like really saying that like, yeah, it's the woman's fault for like wearing whatever or acting however that like she's sort of asking for being harassed, which we were like, whoa, like this is beyond just like a man thing. Like this is like the whole society is against women are against women. So that was really tough to realize. And then also that, of course, the idea that like, oh, all men are bad. Like there were a lot of men that were like, yeah, it's a terrible thing. Like they should not be doing that. So it was on both sides that there were both problematic and toxic perspectives. Also, we interviewed people that like wear full niqab, like the full covering, and they've been harassed so much. And I'm like this is completely like evidence that this has nothing to do about your appearance at all. They're like, oh, it's her eyes. Like, oh my God, like please. We were thinking that, oh, is this like an issue of, sexual repression? But it definitely feels like it's more of a power thing and a power dynamic versus anything about like flirting or any of that kind of thing. That it's definitely like, I have power over you. This is my way of feeling like I have power.
And you put yourself in it. How was that?
I mean, I felt okay because I did have like like I had the backup cameras and things like that. So it felt like I wasn't by myself, with all of it. And of course, like I lived in Egypt for 3 years, so I already knew my experiences with it. But, it was a little scary to like be confronting it with other like bystanders.
Do you think it's changed how you respond to street harassment today?
Yes, definitely. I feel like I've become much stronger in my responses since hearing all these stories and like just being like entrenched in all of the situations that other people have experienced. And I was like, oh, like it's super important for harassers to know that like we also have agency and that like that their behavior is not okay. But also, accepting that not everyone will respond in the same way. Like if you don't respond and like you do freeze or that kind of thing, like not beating yourself up about it because, you have to give yourself grace and whatever you can do to heal yourself is the most important thing versus trying to attack the other person.
It's kind of like the purpose of the podcast is sort of to understand how storytelling plays into social justice and into building power. So I'd love to hear how you felt that personal storytelling did that in either of your films.
Even just like through my identities, being Mexican and Palestinian, I see that as political just by having those identities, and that having this very personal narrative allows our stories to be, humanized and people can empathize with it beyond just thinking about like a social issue of like, physical structures or like war. And having this personal experience puts the viewer directly in my shoes, for example. So that's been super powerful. And then the same thing with the People's Girls, having like 3 characters and going in depth with their stories of like what happened with them, how are they healing from harassment in their lives and what they had to deal with, that these very intimate stories can allow for that behavioral and like mindset shifts that is not possible otherwise.
You mentioned that you felt like your identity as a Mexican and Palestinian combined has been politicized. I'd love to hear more about how you felt that politicization has affected you and how you've experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, like growing up in the U.S. in like the suburbs, I didn't really think about it at all ever, but it is a part of me. And especially as I got into college and started learning about like what's happening in Palestine and all of that, like that is in my blood, like that trauma and that experience and these people, like that could have been my father easily, but unfortunately they were forced to leave. So like I feel an obligation within myself that there is something within me that I have to be able to like advocate for both sides of like both my dad and then of course with my grandmother like facing domestic violence, that like telling her story is so important because like I am a product of her courage of leaving that man, and like it's a prime example for other women that are and men and women that are experiencing this and how to recover and that there is a life after that violence too.
I think you had mentioned earlier, like the dual violence of the state and of the patriarchy and the way that that is like also passed down in you. I mean, it's science, right? It's like trauma is physically passed down from generations, which is crazy. Um, but yeah, thank you for telling me about that. I'd also love to hear about what unique ways you feel like you're able to tell your story versus how you've seen similar stories told in popular media or by outsiders. Um, Obviously, both like Palestinian and Mexican identities are like contentious in US politics and have led to very problematic narratives. I feel like being someone who occupies that position, you're able to tell a different story.
Totally. I mean, definitely this is an American story more than anything because it is my identity and I was born and raised in the US. My whole life was in the US. Like, I think that's the biggest connection is that like a lot of Americans will relate to this and my exploration of trying to figure out these other cultures that I am from, but I didn't know much about, So there is that super close parallel for other people who are not necessarily from these cultures, but like are also children of immigrants and have had similar experiences. The other thing for my medium is that because my father, as I mentioned, he was a wedding videographer, he filmed like over 100 hours of us of VHS footage. So I have like an archive of us growing up that is going to help enrich the story tremendously of like my upbringing and then also my family and our characters and like the relationships between all of us. So that's something that like is very unique and that I'm very grateful that my father created this treasure trove for me to use now too.
You have like an archive of you growing up. Basically, that must be really bizarre. I would feel like it's so strange seeing yourself as a kid. So going off of you explaining like what's unique about how you tell your story, I'd love to hear about whether you've always felt in control of your own story.
I would say that I did not feel in control of my story. That, growing up, I was raised in a very conservative, strict household that had a lot of rules placed on me and that I did not feel that I had the independence and freedom to be who I wanted to be and like be my authentic self. And, this journey of the film has really put me on like an inner healing journey too of like accepting who I am and being okay with like honing in on the both like good things and not great things about me, and that full package is perfect in its own way, and really getting to like fully accept that and healing that like inner child inside of me that like just faced a ton of criticism and a lot of just not feeling worthy because that was passed down of like the trauma again. So I don't feel like I'm fully there still too, but like this experience of like really going in deep into my heart of like what has been affecting me for so many years and trying to name it and place it both with me and my brother of like going back and forth and through therapy. That I'm starting to really feel like, okay, I'm starting to get a bit better understanding of like who I am and my identity and accepting who I am as this like mixed person that maybe I won't ever feel fully Mexican or Palestinian or American, and that it's not even about the cultures either. It's like about who I am as a person and my character, and also like, even the deeper spiritual side of things too, and just like accepting this whole package of myself.
I'm so happy to hear that. I hope you're the first of many like children of immigrants to like go into that healing journey and to understand that it's okay to be like an individual person and not represent worlds.
And it's okay to be happy. That's the other thing. Like, it's okay to be happy. Like it feels like, oh, I shouldn't be allowed to live in bliss because like all my ancestors had to deal with so much. Like, why am I the one that gets to like have a great life and be happy? And it's like, they built this for you. Like, they went through all this. They would love to see you happy and fulfilled. Like, it's not a bad thing. Oh man, and that's something to like really reconcile. That it's like it's okay. Like, accept it and like embrace it.
Yeah, it's like this like tragedy of having to like constantly compensate for like the sacrifices made for you. So you feel like you have to take that on as well and to suffer and to continue the chain of trauma, right? Like, which is ridiculous. That's I can't even begin to tell you how much I relate to that. I really do. So I'd love to hear more about what art has influenced and inspired you in your work.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I've watched a lot of like experimental documentary too, and like how the story can be told in abstract ways, especially because I have so much archival, like thinking beyond the normal traditional documentary structures and being able to tell the story without telling the story, like showing the story, I guess is my goal for this film. And a lot of experimental work has influenced that. I'd also say some books I've read. The Lemon Tree is one that's amazing. That's about like a Palestinian right of return kind of story too. That was very inspiring to me. There's a few narrative films also that like have had that emotional arc. Like Lion was one that I was like, oh my god, this like I'm going back to like find his family. But I'm like, wow, this is weirdly paralleling too. Yeah, but definitely the film space is where I find most of my inspiration for sure.
I know we've talked a lot about your films. I'd love to talk about your advocacy work. I know that you co-founded the Mezcla Media Collective and you've been working to support women and non-binary filmmakers. How did you turn towards advocacy after like during your creative work and why?
So, I mean, I was always, as I mentioned from the beginning of like wanting to do documentary, was I always was interested in social impact, and I was filming a lot for nonprofit in college and after college, like just in the nonprofit space and like seeing different ways how video could support other work. And I had taken a few like community organizing classes and community development classes in college, and that was always just something I was super interested in, like how to create collective change and collective power in communities that have been historically excluded. So as I entered more into the documentary space, specifically in Chicago, it was very hard to find other women of color that and non-binary filmmakers of color that were working and thriving in the space and that I could collaborate with. So I met another colleague of mine and we're like, okay, like maybe we could like make an event or something or like a little collective and see who ends up showing up. And after that event, which was back in 2017, over 70 people attended that event. And it was obvious that there was like a very strong need for an organization like this to create access and resources that were just not there in Chicago. So since then, since 2017, we're now at like 700 members that really range from documentary, narrative, sound, cinematographers, and we have created very useful programming around educational workshops and like being able to have rough cut feedback screenings, these types of things that just like were not available for our community specifically, and really starting to build our own table for representation in the industry. So it's been amazing to see how much it's grown organically, not because of me, but because of all of those that are like super interested in making this shift in the Chicago film industry.
That's so powerful. I love that you you felt like you were sort of like not feeling supported and then you realized that this whole host of people were feeling the same way. I think what you do really well is like community building in your films and also in your nonprofit work, and I think that's really awesome. So is there any advice you would give to up and coming filmmakers, women of color especially, like as they're trying to navigate this space and also navigate their own traumas and their own healing?
Yeah, totally. I mean, definitely giving yourself time is huge. My goal is to finish this film in like 2 years, which was a joke. I was like, I don't know what I was thinking. Like, of course, you have to to get on this healing journey, you have to allow patience and grace in your life and like allowing that this process will unfold as it needs to. So I've sort of given up on a timeline. I'm like, when it's done, it's done. When I feel it's done kind of thing. So allowing yourself that time and that it's okay to take breaks and like to rewatch later, it's like taking a pause. And then the other main thing I would say is definitely trying to build as many connections as possible in the industry is so important because the film industry is so connection based, really starting to make that network for yourself of like, even in your community, if you can meet other filmmakers, meet other mentors, that kind of thing it's vital for this very, like lonely process if you do it by yourself. Oftentimes, especially in documentary, like you're the one shooting, editing, producing. So like starting to build that team and support system around you is vital.
Is there a story that you're building towards right now in your personal life? I know that you're like working through this film and you're creating it. Is there something, what story are you building right now?
So for the story of my life, I would say there's two components of it. One is being able to use my privilege and my skills and my resources to support others. That is number one for me, to like, share whatever I've received to others. And like, whether that be through Mezcla, I love animals. I love animal shelter work and like other creatures, other beings in general. That's something that is super important to me, and that really gives me a lot of fulfillment to know that I'm like a servant to others first. And then the second piece is just coming back to the self-acceptance piece of just like feeling self-acceptance deeply and feeling like I am totally secure in who I am and where I'm going in my life, and that that I am forging my path fully on my own is very important. And having a deeper awareness and consciousness of just like the world in general and inner me. I don't know how to explain that, but like, yeah, on the spirituality side, getting more of like an inner sustainment inside of me too.
Yeah, that was very well put for like such a big, giant question. I'm like, process your whole life right now on a recording for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can continue supporting Colette's work online on the website for Traces of Home and on the website for the Mezcla Media Collective. You can also follow her work on Instagram at Traces of Home or at Mezcla Media Collective. Thank you for listening. You can find Calling Others on major podcast platforms or on Win Without War's website. The music found in this episode is from Storyblocks, and this episode was produced and edited by me, Nasta Anfar, and Natalie Bettendorf. See you next time.